sort of a special type of thing. We're not really doing politics and policy this for Easter weekend. We're doing instead some real personal stories and personal stories of courage. And there's one particular author who wrote about many personal stories of courage. He wrote the book Brotherhood, and the author is here with me for this interview. His name is Martin Pengelly. He's a Washington breaking news correspondent for Guardian U.S., based in Washington, D.C., where he lives with his wife and 3 daughters. He was born, though, in Leeds, UK, Great Britain. He played rugby for Durham University and Rosslyn Park FC and worked for Rugby News, The Guardian, and The Independent before moving to the United States in 2012. Since then, he has written about politics, books, and rugby in America. His work has also appeared in Sports Illustrated and the New York Times. Brotherhood is his first book. And I met Martin just recently when I was back at West Point for the rugby alumni festivities. My husband played rugby at West Point, and so we ended up meeting at their dinner that night. And I have his book, and I've started reading his book, and I've read a lot of his book in preparation for this interview. And actually, there were times where I just didn't want to put it down. I wanted to read the rest of the story. And it's interesting, Martin, because you write this book, and essentially you write it about, well, I'll just read what Lieutenant General McMaster, just how he described your book. He said, this is a story of a rugby team. Martin Pengelly played lock forward in London in 2002 against those to whom he is about to introduce you. Brotherhood is a brilliant group biography of the individual cadets who played against Pengelly's Rosslyn Park Football Club. But it's also much more than that. And so you write this book about essentially 15 rugby players from West Point who came over, and in one game, you met them, and then you had beers like you always do after a rugby game afterwards. And based on that, you were so motivated to write this book. And it seems odd, I think, to most folks that this one incident kind of struck you. So tell us more about why you invested so much time into writing such a detailed book.
I will. Thank you for having me on. It was definitely a question of so much time, because between the game in 2002 and between writing the first steps of the book for The Guardian in 2015, that was 13 years. It did, though, for one game, really stick in my mind. It made a huge impression on me physically, because the cadets were extraordinarily strong and aggressive. My opposite number was about 4 inches taller than me, and I'm 6'4". But also mentally, I'd never played against a team of American soldiers before, a team of American cadets, and it is true that at the time, and I noted it down in my diary, I noted that Afghanistan had already been invaded after 9/11. We all knew Iraq was coming, even though it was a year away then. So I always wondered what might have happened to these players, what they might have experienced, where they might have gone, where they might have fought. They were in the first class that graduated in wartime after Vietnam. So 30 years on, 9/11, they came out into an army at war. So it stayed in my mind. I wouldn't have written it had I not moved to America to work here, had I not married an American, had 3 American girls knitted myself in. It wouldn't have been possible, but it became possible because the Guardian newsroom is in New York. I'm now in DC, but they're New York. One day, the sports editor let me go up to West Point just to see if I could find a story. And as you said, there are 15 stories there, 16 if you include the coach, many more if you include families. But a number of stories were outlined to me on that very first day, and I knew I was going to have to do it. So I did, and fate has allowed it to become a book, which is what I wanted.
Well, it's incredibly detailed and incredibly personal, which I found shocking. But ahead of that question, because I do have more to talk about with that, did you have preconceived thoughts about West Point and cadets and the cadets who currently attend there prior to writing the book? And did those notions change?
Yeah, I did. It was a foreign world to me. I'd been in New York for 3 years when I started the book, or started the piece that preceded the book. So I had a few ideas about West Point. I had read things like Charles Dickens' Visit There in 1842. More recently, I'd read James Salter, the novelist, wrote a few different memoirs of being there. He didn't like it. And I'd read The Long Grey Line by Rick Atkinson, which is a monumental book. And very early in the writing, I read In a Time of War by Bill Murphy Jr., which is a book about the O2 class. So I had things to expect about the military education, the rigidity of it, the beasting of cadets into making them into soldiers, which was all very different from my world. I'm a rugby player, but I'm a British liberal journalist who comes from a place of not a very military place, put it that way. So I had my preconceptions. I'm also a double history grad, so I was ready for that. I was fully prepared to buy in to the history of West Point. I've always had an interest in military history, British and world. So I was kind of prepared to go there and not prepared for what I found. And in writing the book and in getting to know the guys, some of them very well, and the families, I've obviously attained a much greater understanding of cadet culture and what West Point's about.
All right, we're going to take a short break with Martin Pengelly, and we'll be right back with more from The Real Story with Jeanne Ives.
Now, more of The Real Story with your host, Jeanne Ives.
Well, welcome back. We're here with Martin Pengelly. So your book is incredibly detailed. You have specific conversations, historical details about particular missions in war and in training. This wasn't an easy book to write, especially probably with somebody with no familiarity with military operations. So what effort did it take to write a book like this? I mean, I was shocked at the level of detail in it.
Yeah, it's tremendous effort. I mean, I've never been an investigative reporter. I've mostly been an editor in my life, so I had to actually steel myself to do the reporting and to chase things down. And then, as you indicate, it goes into some fairly complicated places and some fairly dark places. So there was a lot of work to do. Most of it was being led by conversations with everybody I talked to, the players, their families, their friends. A lot of it was, there was a lot of background research and asking experts and other authors. So David Finkel of the Washington Post, who wrote The Good Soldiers about Rustenmeyer, was a key source. Tom Ricks, former Wall Street Journal and Washington Post reporter who wrote 2 histories of the Iraq War, was vital. Brian Kastner, the ex-explosive disposal officer who I found completely by accident by finding his book in a second-hand shop, reading it and calling him. I was starting from but basically the only thing I didn't start from scratch on was rugby, where I had the advantage because that's in my soul. So it was a lot of work, and it led to some very complicated places and a lot of fact-checking, a lot of very kind, the guys I mentioned and others who kindly read it for that kind of thing. Guardian colleagues who reported from the Iraq War, who embedded with various kinds of patrols, which I was describing, who could tell me about that. One Guardian colleague, Rory Carroll, who was kidnapped in Baghdad and survived basically because he was Irish, not British. It was an amazing, sweeping thing to do, and there's lots more subject areas that I could have gone into that would have taken me into a longer book, but I had to keep it to about 400 pages.
Well, it's interesting, because you do follow these 15 cadets as they progress through their military career, and all of them at varying stages. Some got out, they served their time in Iraq, they got out immediately, some stayed in. One particular cadet, though, that you write about is Zach Miller. And, of course, every one of these cadets is connected because they were on that 2002 rugby team that you played against, and that was a connection here. But you write about Zach Miller, and I'm glad that you did, because I don't think that people understand that even the training is dangerous. And so Zach Miller graduated near the top of his class at West Point. He won a Rhodes Scholarship. And at about that time, they were offering to cadets, if they wanted to immediately after graduation, they could go straight from graduation to Ranger School. And Zach Miller was super motivated, highly motivated. He also seemed to be, because according to the way that your account of him, you talk to his classmates about him being almost an overachiever to the point where he had to go through Ranger School before he went to Rhodes, because he had to get that check mark on his resume for what he potentially wanted to do in his future. I mean, that's a pretty personal detail to write about, but his roommate reveals this to you, obviously, in this conversation you have with him. And then you write this. They found Zach Miller's body on the Tricolor Road land navigation course at Fort Benning on Monday, July 1st, 2002, at 8 o'clock in the evening. He had been missing for 6 hours and 21 minutes. It had been a brutally hot day, above 90 degrees, heat category 5, when the Army recommends that hard work of any kind be limited to 10-minute increments and that 1.5 quarts of fluids be consumed every hour. Miller was last seen on a dirt trail at the top of a wooded berm. He left the trail, dropping his map, his cap, his glasses as he came down the slope. When he was found, he was still carrying a whistle to attract attention if in trouble. and half a quart of water. I mean, amazing writing. But I think it's really important. You then went on to speak with his parents and get their perspective on everything. I mean, that's pretty emotional discussions.
It's very difficult. Yeah, it's very, very difficult to do. Zach's parents, Rosalind and Keith, are two of the nicest people I've ever met. They were utterly helpful. They were open. They provided documents, which the Army didn't provide. The Army, in that case, provided some, but not all of them. It's a case of wanting to get the full story of what happened. Very simply, just to tell the full story in a book, in any form you're doing. And also to count out any rumors that might be around or anything people don't know that people are guessing at about what happened to Zach, why did it happen. It's not possible to do the full exact story because Zach died alone. Zach was doing solo land navigation. But it was just a case of having to gird myself really to be ready to go to where these stories led me, Zach and the other guys who died. And if they lead you to awful places, they do. There was a sort of in a process of writing the whole book, which I've mentioned in a few remarks about it, which was a very close friend of mine, a writer who's written not on the military, but has written serious books. I was having some doubts about the darkness of some of the places I was being led by my research and interviews about what should go on the page, and he simply said, Don't flinch. Put everything on the page. Don't flinch. They didn't, meaning Zach and his teammates. They didn't flinch. It happened to them. So I didn't. And as a result, some of the book makes for pretty tough reading for me. I wrote it. Never mind.
No, I felt the same way. And, I come from a military background. I graduated from West Point as well. And, you can't tell these stories too much and impart on people exactly what it takes to go into combat. And one of the people you talk about was Jim Gerbes. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. He's interesting too. He gets injured early on, can't really make it, basically makes it through infantry basic course by hook or crook, can't really move on to Ranger, can't get actually slotted into a combat position, which is what he wanted to do, what he felt like he was built to do. This is what he wants to do. I mean, rugby is a fairly violent game. And if you're a rugby player, you know what it takes to walk into that scrum and do what you have to do to win. So this is the mentality of these same types of folks. They want to be real soldiers, and he gets disappointed in that he can't continue on in combat arms. So by hook or crook, he finds his way to Fort Stewart, and then finds that they need a special team that is going to go ahead of convoys and essentially clear the road or be an escort. And so he finds his way into combat that way, and he ends up losing his life, killed by an IED on the road in Iraq. Now, I I was a transportation officer, so this particular part you said, in the Iraq war, transportation was never an easy place to be. Thank you. Appreciate that. In convoy security, the job bore many hallmarks of what was required of infantry, but without anything close to the equipment, expertise, and support. Keeping spirits up was tough. Studies showed that transportation units had some of the worst morale in the entire American force, and that they're very much overworked and underappreciated, in my opinion, as a former transportation officer. But I mean, your words speak to so many folks who have worked in the military. I mean, I wasn't in combat. I don't make anybody assume that, but you can find yourself in combat, and you're not even a combat officer.
The platoon that Jim put together was really they proudly admit a bunch of
misfits,
oddballs, ragtags, misfits, who were just sort of. There's a hilarious or grimly hilarious point in the book where one of them, Zach, the driver, describes how his sergeant came up to him and said with various obscenities I won't repeat, "You want to do something cool over here?" So he did. And he ended up in top flight security, which they nicknamed the platoon top flight as a quotation from an Ice Cube stoner movie. It's not as elite as it's meant to sound, which I found out in the telling and told the families didn't know that. It's this remarkable, in that sense, a tale of how Jim made the best of what he had, the knee injury sustained playing rugby that ruined his dreams of going infantry, and used that. Found his way to transportation. Found his way for the transportation job because a colonel was looking for officers, and that colonel had played rugby at West Point. That's one of the things that happened quite a lot. And it's a grim irony. You have to be aware of cheap ironies when you're an author, but also aware of how dramatic irony works, because the knee injury sustained in rugby sent Jim to where he, I think I say, sent him out on the path to his death. But it also gave him a new lease of life. Before that, that's what made his military career worthwhile to him. Is what combat was what he wanted to do, leading men, and eventually he did it, not in the way he thought he would do, and to his obviously ultimate cost.
Well, and I think military spouses should read this because you go into detail and you have these conversations with Jim's wife and what it took for her to get through some of the depression he was experiencing when he couldn't go into combat arms, and how important that was to him. So just really great tales about it. So we only have a couple minutes left here, but I wanted to ask a couple more questions. Like, what did you learn about military operations and commanders that you may have been surprised by?
I think I learned a lot about the basic humanity of everybody involved. So everybody makes mistakes. Everybody improvises. Everybody, to a degree, does the best that they can. I was probably wary of falling into portraying any army as a sort of too well-oiled a machine, or going too far the other way and calling it chaos. It was fascinating to me to have a repertorial window on, as it were, army life in a war zone as everyday, ordinary life.
Okay, and then finally, what do you want the reader to get out of this book?
A sense of what these guys did, what they meant to each other, what their team meant to each other. For sure, I do want them to get a sense of what rugby meant to them, because rugby is my lifelong passion, and this is the only rugby-based idea I've ever had that would make a book, and that basically had to be a book. It wouldn't leave me alone for a long time. I got lucky in getting the book deal to do it through a publisher who played rugby for Harvard, so he saw what the story was. But I would like American readers particularly to get a sense of the game and what it means, because the World Cup's coming here in 7 years' time, the Men's World Cup. And World Rugby is making a play for America. But more than rugby, it's about the Brotherhood. It's about the spirit. It's about it ends up being about male friendships, male bonds. I could easily write a book called Sisterhood if I found the same kind of story about women's rugby or not. It's about women in the army. Just in this case, this is a very tight-knit group of 15 men, what they meant to each other and what they went through.
Well, it's a remarkable book, and I thank you so much for joining me on this Easter weekend to talk about courage and people who have given up their life in defense of our nation. Martin Pengelly, Washington breaking news correspondent for The Guardian. I really appreciate your book. Terrific read. I highly encourage folks to pick it up. And maybe we'll have you back on about politics and policy. That might be fun, too.
I would love to. I'll be delighted.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much.